All right, everybody, I got 10:01. So in the interest of everyone's time, as we were saying before the meeting started, a lot of us have seemingly back-to-back meetings today. So I want to make sure everybody has some time here for you. So thank you everyone for attending the March edition of the DuPage ROSC presentation series. My name is Jared. I'm the coordinator for the DuPage ROSC. If you have not been able to attend one of these as of yet, this is a monthly presentation, usually by a partner, someone who's takes part in DuPage ROSC, to kind of get a little bit more in depth on a particular topic related to recovery from both substance use and mental health disorder. Gives us time to kind of dig a little bit deeper. This month, as you can kind of see already up on the screen, we're going to be talking about stimulants. I've mentioned this at the previous meeting and in the emails too. We're kind of living in a time, not only in Northern Illinois, but in the country where the opioid crisis kind of gets a lot of the headlines, right? That's kind of what we hear about all the time. But stimulant use is also up. Stimulant use is something that continues to increase, and it's a particular drug of choice that gets overlooked often up here. And so I thought it was just timely to be able to talk a little bit more about stimulants for those of us like myself who really don't know a whole lot about some of that stuff, to kind of dig a little bit deeper on that. So we are welcoming John Skocz, who is from Central DuPage Hospital. He handles the addictions inpatient and outpatient programs over at Central DuPage. He's also a really good friend to the ROSC, has been attending for over a year. And he actually presented for us at one of our presentation series a few months ago on cannabis. And it was actually very enlightening because there was some great history as well as some information about, cannabis legalization and then what the state of Illinois is kind of dealing with since it's been legalized. So I'm sure we'll get some even more amazing information about stimulants from him. At the end, we'll hopefully leave a little bit of time for any questions or comments. The only two housekeeping things, if everybody could make sure that your microphones are muted, just so John can get through his presentation. And then at the end, if you do have questions or comments, we'll let you come through and do that. If you're interested in sharing your contact information, you can do that in the chat. You can put your name and contact info. And then that way, if anybody wants to connect after the meeting, we can do that. So enough of the housekeeping stuff. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to John. Thanks, John.
Well, thank you, Jared. And thanks for having me again here. And thank you to the ROSC for giving me the opportunity. I do enjoy putting these together and presenting them when I get the opportunity. So I was looking forward to present on this because it's something myself that it's been a while since I've looked at it. You know, a lot of what we experience here in our program is still a lot of alcohol, a lot of opiates, and a lot of benzos tend to be the most prolific of what people are getting treated for. There are a few that will come in that do have with them cocaine in their use history or their profile, if you will, but it's not their dominant drug of choice in comparison. So what we're going to look at here today is an overview, not a direct, like this is how this drug works on the body for each part, but more of what they are, what's out there, and a broader sweep of how they impact our body, but also to how they're impacting our society, and to what Jared has already begun to show is that there's more going on with stimulant use than anyone's really noticing because of the prolific harm of fentanyl and other opiates. So let's get started. So start off with a little bit of history and culture. So what I found interesting here is that there's over 4,000 plants worldwide that actually fall under some sort of framework to be a substance that causes stimulant effect on the body. And I never thought there was that many. And there's actually 60 of them that we use. We use them directly from what they are to how they're found here, as we'll see, all the way down to different ways they're altered through labs and food process plants to show up in such things as our everyday foods, meals, vitamins, and supplements. So the genus of the plant that contains most of the stimulant alkaloids, for example, would be like nicotine is found in tobacco and coca. Well, that's the cocaine. And we're going to talk a lot about cocaine and a few more here. But they've existed for over 250 million years, which was very interesting. And I was like, well, why would they be here? It turns out that it's a defense mechanism. It's a toxicity that was the plant developed to prevent itself from getting eaten back then during the herbivore dinosaurs and things like that. So what we do find is that most of the common stimulant plants that are out there is the ephedra plant, tobacco, coca, tea, coffee, betel nut, and cat leaves. And I'll talk about those a little bit as we get into it, but the some of these were ones that maybe have popped up. At least cat was something I had seen before, heard about briefly, but wasn't anything that was ever of any prevalence, especially around here by any means, but not very common within the US. But in terms of its growth and being used worldwide, it actually is rather common, just not in our continent. Same goes for the betel nut, which that's, as we'll see later, is actually not its true name. It's more of its a nickname, if you will. So what we find with it, with these stimulant-based plants, these ones that are out there, well, shows that Neanderthals were actually beginning to use them because they found the ephedra plant 50,000 years ago. And it made me think about some of the other stories, things I've read, some of the speakers I've heard, and just talking about like the ancient history, if you will, of alcohol and how that's found in a lot of, well, religious books to a point, and how there's very specific faiths that have very specific rules regarding it. And to that, some of these other plants, such as cat, is actually something that's used in more of the Muslim religion and faith for those believers, because they can't use alcohol, but they can use this plant, and that's not going against any of their beliefs or rules. So the Neanderthals began to use the ephedra about 50,000 years ago. And during that Neolithic period, 12,000 years ago, revealed the evidence of more significant use of the plant. And the reason to that was the later part of the Stone Age. And people began to settle permanent villages, transitioning with different tools, setting up societies. So they had that ability to stay in one spot, cultivate the plants for their use, as well as, I think, have more of a sense to develop some leisure time too. Along with that came other things such as their belief systems and rituals too. So next, the plants fulfilled, well, a lot of those purposes and meanings to the culture of the people at the time. A lot of religion and spiritual practices and rituals. Some of the things would be shamans for the religious experience, exorcising of different illnesses, demons to some religious beliefs, all the way to just as medicines too for different ailments of their time, of what they believed and how it would be helpful. For example, I mean, if someone is, feeling maybe, well, we would now maybe say depressed, if you gave them a stimulant, well, they're going to be more active. They'll get some more energy. They'll be up. They'll be moving around. Perhaps if it's something that is, they have a cold and they're not feeling well and they want to rest. Well, they take some of the stimulant plant, such as the ephedra. Well, now you'll be up. You'll be activated. You'll be able to go out and work because you'll be feeling better because you have the artificial energy. So other times they showed up was special treats and during celebratory ceremonies. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about chocolate here, but it does have caffeine in it, and it was highly used for different ceremonies, as we'll see briefly here in a moment. At times they were simply just for leisure, and then to also assist their warriors during battle. And we'll see that practice really does continue very far into our even modern day practices. So it was often consumed mostly by mixing it into a drink, chewing it, but not swallowing it, just chewing on it like you would chewing tobacco or smoking it. The impact of the culture was really so profound, it actually made it into their artwork. What you can see in the statue, which is a Peruvian statue here, is about, I think they said 500 BC, if I'm recalling the article correctly. On the wood statue, hopefully you can see it okay, but you'll notice that the cheeks of the statue actually look like they're bulging a little bit. And that was because they used it so much that this was the coca leaves, that they would make special pouches and packages with them, and they would carry them in their mouth all day long, and they would have it there sitting there just as one would maybe have like a chewing tobacco dip in their mouth. So they would carry this, their mouths would bulge, they would be happy, they'd be working, and to a point they even began to use it as a system of measurement. They would say that, you know, one pouch got you so many miles, because when that pouch wore out, you no longer felt anything from it, you threw it out, you got the next one. It took about 45 minutes. So they would measure how far it took them to do different jobs, to walk certain distances and things like that, just based upon how long the stimulant effect was working on it. So here is a part to that statue as well. So again, now 5000 BC, they had it developed there. They found that they were exploring it out in the Andes Mountains. So Peru, Ecuador, peoples and culture. And here's the part about the coca beans, the caffeine on top of the flavor. But 1500 BC to 400 BC, you have the Olmecs, 1000 BC to 900 AD, the Mayans, and it continued to the Toltecs and Aztecs in the Yucatan Peninsula beyond that. So it's long-standing. If you really look at, I mean, that's thousands of years that this is being used, being talked about, being moved forward in the cultures, even to today with Peru and Ecuador, from that 5000 BC to now. It's still a very dominant part of their practices, their culture, and their substance use. Then, as I was mentioning before about the Muslim faith, about 1238 AD, khat was then began to be used by people of the South Arabian Peninsula and the Horn of Africa. Because of their faith, they could not use alcohol or any fermented such product, but this product, this stimulant plant, which naturally grows there, was okay. So this was a way that they could alter their mind and mood without committing any offense. And then as we start to move a little bit closer to time now, it was actually, well, when Christopher Columbus came over on his adventures here in 1492, he brought back tobacco to Europe, and that brought with it a couple different things. They were saying that Europe was thrilled to have it, and they made many trips and exploited the indigenous people to get it, of course, but at the same time, some of the rulers for some of the different countries were not very thrilled with the fact that it had come over from the other continent, and they found it was something that was actually troublesome to them, because now they had different costs, fees associated with it, and they kind of brought in more of those issues with not wanting to have this kind of import, if you will, just for their own kind of personal beliefs and impact. But that's okay, because eventually, when we came over to start settling the 13 colonies and such, in 1612, the local indigenous people introduced, well, our settlers to tobacco. And off we went. They noted that the tobacco leaf was so dominant in the development of the colonies that even the very first White House that they built was adorned with tobacco leaves as a prominent decoration, even up on the dome, because it held such a high mark in our society at that time because of its value, of what we could use it for trade, what it meant to the people, the strength of the country at the time. So these really do start to show that a plant that eventually becomes very problematic as we go through time here, does have and still does hold quite a footprint in our society. So in 1859, the cocoa leaves were commonly chewed and absorbed by consumers' gum until German chemist Albert Neum isolated the alkaloid cocaine from the cocoa leaf. So this is a gentleman who basically altered what the user's experience was. Using the leaf in those manners of chewing it or smoking it, if you will, it was a very mild reaction, if you will, very mild increase of energy, increase of euphoria. It was very, very mild. But by isolating the alkaloid, if you will, making it to the powder piece, it massively changed how intense it was to the user. So, as I mentioned, so it also changed how one could use it. Now, it can be injected and it can be inhaled. And you can still absorb it through your gums, but not in the same way of chewing it by rubbing it on there. But that all changes how fast it enters the bloodstream and how quick it goes from the bloodstream to the brain, crosses that barrier, and how fast it's metabolized in the synapses, causing those massive dopamine, serotonin, other transmitters we're going to cover here in a moment, and what it does to the body and why it becomes so massively addictive so quickly. But our world didn't stop there, because in 1863, the French chemist Angelo Marini began marketing and selling cocaine wine. Yes, being Marini, as you will, and it was a medical tonic. It was good for whatever ailed you at the time. Sold it, very popular, because no one really understood that this was going to be a problem. So, and of course, I don't think it would be complete without mentioning Freud at least once in this presentation, because in 1884, he published his work suggesting how cocaine should be used to treat asthma, decrease the severity of gastric disorders, and serve as an aphrodisiac, and, believe it or not, help one who is addicted to morphine or alcohol at the time. Thinking about what he said in 1884 to our current standards of 2023, it's to me, reading it again was almost comical to think that, but back then that's what made sense. That's what made sense to them, their society, their culture, what they understood of the substance and everything. And to a point, cocaine is still medically used today. More of a topical anesthetic. We're going to see in a moment how it actually revolutionized one type of medicine and medical procedures. But it also did have a purpose there to help with asthma because of the broncho dilators that it caused there. So it could actually serve these purposes that he was talking about. Not so much with the aphrodisiac, we'll see that later too, nor the cross addiction of the morphine and alcohol. But to a point, the gastric disorders too, it could actually help with. But it's also extremely addicting, and that brings with it many, many more problems. But all that promotion of the cocaine by the scientific and medical world then really did sell it. People took off with it. All sorts of different unregulated companies, honestly. I have a few, we'll see in the next slide, but really anyone could make any claim, use any amount, because the regulations weren't there to say what you're putting in it, how much was there, any side effects or problems like we see now. And it took a full generation, they were saying, from not till 1900s, as we get into it, to notice, wait a minute, this use of cocaine, along with other substances, as you know, opium was also highly used in different medicines and freely available at the times too. But this availability really took a stark change once people began to realize its devastating impact. So what I grabbed here is just one of those many things. It's a cocaine tablets. You take it for your toothache, and sure, of course it would, because it's going to push some of that swelling away. It's going to make you feel a little bit better because it gives you energy. It makes you feel euphoric, and you might not notice your tooth hurts. But now you're also noticing you need to use more and more of that toothache medicine there. So I apologize because I noticed that I have a duplication of information at the top, but we'll move past that. I realize it there. So here's another one. This is Dr. Rose's obesity powder. So it's a positive cure for your obesity. It attends to your ills, safe, pleasant, effective, and completely harmless, as you can see there, and only for $1. This Sirocco chemical laboratory here in Chicago produced a lot of these. Dr. Rose was one of these many different tonics, if you will. They would not be really anything that was based in medical stuff, except knowing that, well, you can use cocaine, it makes people feel better, and they keep buying it for some reason. But since stimulants are an appetite suppressant, it would bear that it's going to reduce your appetite, but only during the time that it's actually active. Until you metabolize it out, then you'll have a return of your hunger. They also use things like this to help, as Freud mentioned, for alcohol disorder. They would have different tonics and things like that to help with the gut health of the person who was afflicted, to get them off of their morphine addictions too. There's many other ads that I did find that were out there, but looking to it, just how it's even worded. I mean, it's hitting sluggish condition of the whole system. I mean, what does that truly mean? And there's nothing in this, and I actually couldn't really find much of anything that ever said what was truly in this, except the kind of common fact that it was a stimulant, and most likely cocaine. So, second most popular ingredient in medicine and tonics during that time period. Opium was still the number one piece there. And as some may have heard before, but that rumor or myth, if you will, is true about Coca-Cola. It did contain 5 milligrams of cocaine in its original recipe. And of course, they did remove it later, but I thought it was an interesting way they had the comparison listed, was that it was about a half a line, which I'm like, that's actually more than I would have imagined, but it was marketed as a brain tonic to improve your intelligence and to help with menstrual distress. And I don't know why that's the way they originally marketed, but they did. I definitely would say, well, we know that stimulants do have that point of confidence and focus, and a little grandiosity can come with it too. And maybe some less pain and discomfort, if you will, as they note there. But a lot of the marketing then really didn't make sense. They were just trying to get as many people as possible to buy as much of anything. There was many pieces. The 1905 Sears and Roebuck catalog is actually if you ever get to physically find one, but if not, you can find it some of the parts online. But going through that and looking at what was actually available for consumers at the time is, in our present day terms, just mind-boggling. I mean, they would sell full kits with syringes, the cocaine. They had heroin available, and this is all through Sears and Roebuck, and you can order it. You can have it mailed to your house, and it's all there for your medicinal needs. So moving over from cocaine, we now come into another extremely popular stimulant, which is amphetamine. So 1887 is when it first showed up in the world, and it was manufactured in Germany. And in 1919, Japan came along with methamphetamine. The reason that pulls in is also the beginning parts of when people were looking at attention problems, hyperactivity, things of these different kind of neurodevelopmentals, we would say now, that were present then, trying to find different ways to treat those symptoms. But here's more where a lot of it comes in, which is during World War II, well, America, British, German, Japanese soldiers were all supplied amphetamines. A lot of it, like a lot of it, which it explains why some of the battles were as long as they were, why they would have such tenacious fights when they would have close combat. And another part that's known for those who enjoy learning about World War II is that Hitler himself was a amphetamine addict. His doctor that he had would regularly give him injections of amphetamines to try and keep him going, because he had to stay up for days on end to engage in the war process. There's much video footage that shows a significant tremor that he developed towards the end of the war, and some speculate that was part of the excessive use of all the amphetamines because of its detriment to the dopamine system, which we'll see in a moment. Now, after World War II, as all they would say is all the GIs came back, people did talk a lot about, well, heroin that was there, and then there was cannabis and the reefer madness, but to a point that took over the scene and not many people noticed, but there was a large amphetamine increase as well. Particularly here comes in some of those other stigmas, if you will, about the transportation industry. Truckers, as they would note, using a lot of that so that they could make the long distance drives, get their items there and dropped off. Factory workers. So a lot of people who are working really long hours and putting in a lot of physical labor, mental labor, and then in came to college students with it as well. And to a point, next up came in the appetite suppressants. Well, on one part, just the popularity leading to significant use of amphetamines, which these different diet aids all have some sort of a chemical link back to the amphetamine and methamphetamine. They may now have many different names and many different compounds, but they all have that link, which all plays to the stimulant, which all ties to the, well, heavy dependence and popularity of it and its proliferation throughout, well, food, medicine, and supplements. But even though we had this noted problem arising, we continued to do some of the same things as we did before. During the Vietnam War, when we were over in the country there battling, over 225 million tablets of Dexedrine were supplied to the soldiers. Dexedrine is, I'm gonna have to look for it, but I do believe it's under straight just an amphetamine-based piece, but they would all get many tablets. They get a whole piece of it, and they could just keep using it as it would. It would come through on their supplies and help them to keep alert and to continue to fight. What began to make some of the changes, even after all these things, really started to show up in, well, 1967 and the Summer of Love. They said during that time, and those movements, that actually amphetamine and methamphetamine were a lot more popular than maybe what one would think of with the cannabis, psychedelics, or even opiates, heroin at the time. So move on next. So let's take a look at what stimulant addiction really looks like, had looked like, and is trending into within the US here. So I didn't want to kind of break down every substance. I think on one part we had that knowledge available to us, and I think within some of our fields too, we're kind of aware of what some of these things are, but I at least want to take a look at the popular ones that are out there. So the most common ones, of course, cocaine, powder, also the conversion to rock amphetamines, methamphetamines, the illicit, as well as the FDA one, which is Dasoxin, I would say is how you should say it, for a different piece. Now here's the betel nut, which is, you'll see the real actual scientific name for it there. So the consumers will noted as betel nut, but it says arraic nut. And something I found once, actually, it was a documentary that caught my attention a while back. They were in, I have to look, I believe it was an African country, and oh, they were over there. It's a really hard nut. It kind of bigger than an acorn, if you will. But I mean, it's a good size. But they will break the nut apart. They'll chew on it. They add with it another local plant and some, I believe it's like a salt. So they kind of try to break up some of the acidic and bitter taste to it. One of the things that became most noticeable about it is it causes a lot of red staining. It has a red juice with it, if you will. And people they don't swallow it, they'll spit that out. So as they're talking about its impact in the local towns there, and it wasn't anything restricted to maybe social economics or genders or anything. It was everyone. I mean, the whole town, from all the high end, prestigious, as they would say, the upper class, all the way down to anyone. But what was noticeable was how the town itself, not only did all the residents have the red staining on their mouths and hands and fingers, but they had to expel the juice, if you will. So they had spit all throughout the town, and there was just red stains all over the streets and the sidewalks and everywhere. Caffeine, as we know, and one of the most popular. It's multiple different plants produce it, and it's also FDA monitored, regulated, so it's safely inserted into many of the products that are around. Nicotine from the tobacco product. Many of the pharmaceuticals here, as you notice, a lot of are kind of common names that we see still, to treat ADHD, and perhaps still even some of them will be used for, supposedly supposed to be used for short-term diet aids as prescribed by a doctor for weight loss and weight loss clinics. But it's supposed to be short-term because we'll see they're still all highly addictive. The other ones that were there is the designer really is the bath salts, these synthetic ones, which thankfully have actually taken a downturn since they reached their popularity, maybe about 10 or so years ago, I do believe. So they continue to go down, less people are using them, which is good, but they just want different stimulants. And then there's a couple different brands of the diet pills you'll see there. So why is it that there's all these different versions of it? There's different strengths, there's different plants, there's all these different things that we really as a society continue to look into, use, and find ways to bring into our daily lives. Well, here's what happens. It activates our nervous system, both parts, our central and our peripheral. Let's see if I can move this window here. So the central nervous system, that's our brain and spinal cord. The rest of it, well, that's all the signaling, everything else that runs through our body to make it operate, the peripheral. So that's all the actual nerve ends and nerve pieces you would see, all the things that I think of them as like the wiring system in our body, or any diagram you would see. It's all that piece that's spread out. And the peripheral, then all those nerve endings, wires of the nerves, if you will, is what ties back into the spinal cord and up to the brain. So the peripheral is separated into two different types. We have the autonomic and the somatic nervous system. The the autonomic is the involuntary parts of our body, functions and regulates our glands. So this is going to be breathing, some of the heart rate, those pieces too, what we feel, some of our muscle groups, bowels, lungs, stuff like that. Other parts are still tied to our brain. So what we see then in the somatic nervous system is the muscle movements and the relay of the information. So kind of the other parts of our senses as we respond to what we see, hear, and touch. So the three major categories within the peripheral nervous system is the sensory, autonomic, and motor. As kind of mentioned above there, they pull out the motor nerve as a separate piece. But the way they kind of broke it down on the imaging was there's a group that they would color that goes from this is all the sensory stuff, this is the autonomic as it's mentioned right above, and then the motor part was tied into the ANS and the SNS, that everything flows up through to the CNS, well, basically our brain, right? Our key driving force, as we know. So what happens? Well, here are the major neurotransmitters at play. The acetylcholine, that's our heart. It's our response to vasodilation, the blood vessels, right? The nerves and muscle relays, how things talk to each other, respond, movements of the body parts. Now, norepinephrine and epinephrine do have very close relationships to each other. Something to note here as well is the acetylcholine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. Those were the first three ever discovered as we learn more about human anatomy and neurotransmissions and things like that. So what we see here is norepinephrine and epinephrine both activate within the central nervous system. They're both responsible for that fight and flight. They tie to motivation, our sense of hunger. They also act on our attention, focus, how long we can do it and how well we can do it. That sense of confidence. Another way I think of that is grandiosity. Maybe not in that large sense, but enough to say, no, I feel pretty good. My self-esteem's going up here. I like how that makes me feel. Alertness. Now, what we find though is that the norepinephrine actually has a bit more control on that confidence, feelings of well-being, right? Whereas the epinephrine controls more of that energy piece. It was interesting to see, but the older terms that they don't use from that much anymore really is adrenaline and the noradrenaline. So seeing that was something that kind of made a lot of sense, because when we think about what actually happens when we use a stimulant, we'll see how these transmitters really do override our system. But what happens when we keep forcing our body to overwork? And of course, we have our serotonin, which that's depression, anxiety, another part of the appetite, sleep, and sexual arousal or activity as well. And then, of course, there's dopamine, the major reward chemical, our fine motor activity, our emotional stability, that satiation we get from, well, life activities, really, and the reward control pathway. That's that concept of when they talk about the brain getting hijacked. This is the neurotransmitter that's really the gasoline that overrides everything that runs through, that activates. But let's see what happens when we have too much. So when we use any stimulant, as we know, well, there's the intense euphoria, a lot of energy, all the confidence, alertness, improved performance. But on average, it's 10 times more of those four neurotransmitters gets forced out of the synapses and into our brain, and they're either going to be blocked, so they sit there to keep re-stimulating and keeping that part going, so the energy, right, or the euphoria, and the other ones will, so you have one that forces out and you have one that blocks it, so it can't get taken back up or remetabolized quickly, so it's sitting there re-stimulating over and over and over again until eventually it does break down, and then it gets, as they would say, taken back up or the reuptake, right? But what happens when we keep forcing release of our neurotransmitters, our body forgets how to do it naturally. So we get a natural release of these neurotransmitters when we do certain things such as eating our favorite meal, and you know, how we enjoy the taste, the flavor, we want to have it again, and we've tagged it as our favorite. But if we're using stimulants, maybe we're not going to find that same enjoyment because that food item cannot match what is being introduced through the stimulant. So what happens is those pathways start to turn off. They no longer will release the transmitters, those chemicals, because, well, why should they? Because I can just take a stimulant, I can use the cocaine, the methamphetamine, and that'll do it for me. And I like that better anyways than my favorite food item. So it goes into a state of downregulation, if you will, as it turns off. So these receptor sites are no longer releasing or reuptaking. So the natural stimulation of what we have in life to, you know, basically eat, live, procreate, those kind of natural basic human instincts don't really have as much importance to us anymore, because that drug is that much more powerful. And this begins to create that switch to, I do like that more. I'd rather spend more time with that. I need to go get more of that. That's all I can think about. And then when I don't have it, I start to not feel well. So I got to make sure I keep taking it so that I feel the way I want to feel. And as all that takes place, that's why there is a rapid tolerance and dependency that happens with such intense cravings, because of how fast the brain does that down regulation, turning off all those pieces and saying, no, just use that chemical and do it that way. The natural ways aren't what we're going to do anymore. Now, this stuff does return, of course, as the person stops using it, but it does take some time. And what kind of support do they need? Well, we're going to see. So we saw what the up was like. Now let's see what the down is like. As we would say, the crash, right? It really is kind of the complete opposite. But some of the big hallmarks of a stimulant crash, if you will, is really this intense depression, depending on how much that person's been using and what they've been using. It can last hours to weeks. The person will also have the intense cravings. They're likely to experience that loss of libido because they have no energy, they have no desire for those practices or acts, and they're exhausted because of how overstimulated their body's been in that full gas pedal to the floor kind of state. So the more it lasts, well, now one can say they're starting to go into the withdrawal, right? Because there's a high and then there's a low, you can use more, but when you've sustained your abstinence, you've started your abstinence part, your first couple of days, you're starting into that withdrawal. To note, the way ASAM puts it into their medically managed detox or withdrawal part for the Dimension 1, what they find is that for people who use stimulants, they don't really require a medically managed withdrawal or a detox. But that doesn't mean they shouldn't be inpatient, that they shouldn't maybe be in a residential or a boarding or a rehab level, as we know the different parts of the crosswalk. But they don't need that specific medical detox like one would with benzos, alcohol, opiates, right? So residential services are the more common recommendation for those who are seeking help on stimulant withdrawal and recovery. So this combined history of what, all the way back to what archaeologists have found, all the way to the use of it in cultures worldwide, to our use of it in our American culture, our even marketing of it, to, as I mentioned, in the Sears and Roebuck catalog back in 1905, and which continued for quite a while, truly. But even into the use of it within the military all the way through, the 50s, 60s, and 70s. There was a need to really kind of take a look at it and begin some sort of treatment. So I really just wanted to briefly get a pull back onto the fact that there is the stimulant use disorder in the DSM-5, and all this is because of the significant psychological and physiological harm that happens from stimulant use disorders. We saw the psychological part as we talked about that, the mood changes. In mentioning just the physiological part, sure, you're alert, you have the fight or flight, but what that really means is your heart rate has significantly increased. Your blood pressure has significantly increased. And prolonged use of that over time, well, it weakens the heart muscles, it weakens the blood vessels, the arteries, because everything is expanding and shrinking and pulsating and, well, working as the muscles should and pushing the blood through our body. Well, wears it out, and eventually weak spots can happen. So, and without an overuse over time, and overdoses do happen, and so does death, unfortunately. A lot of times it's cardiac related or vascular related issues. So within the 11 symptoms noted in the DSM-5, like many others, there's the rating system, but it doesn't take many symptoms to really qualify. And there's different specifiers at the time that we have really are amphetamine, cocaine, or other. So it's most common for people between 12 to 25. 12 does seem rather young, but even now on the current studies, what's the one called? I believe it's the, or just had it, and I moved it. National Youth Survey, I believe, part of this piece, but I used it too in the cannabis one, but there's still that ongoing study. So there is still adolescents using stimulants. Sometimes they'll break it down into more different indicators, but I guess overall the idea is that people are still abusing them and at young ages. So, and again, how one uses is indicates how quickly they will progress, or how severe they will struggle with it. So if smoking intravenous make it progress the fastest, then it can only take a few weeks to a few months, they would say, compared to those who inhale or take it orally, which is slower. And for some, it can be months to years before it actually becomes to that severe level. Risk factors, of course, prenatal exposure. So babies born addicted, if you will, does have a adverse childhood event, or an ACE, if you will. So it does kind of predispose them to that system, and even maybe perhaps one could say set them up to be more vulnerable to it if they were ever to use. Postnatal use, really that's parents still using after the baby's been born. So the babies are around it, they see it, they grow up with it, right, as we get older. Exposures to what's happening in the community around the person as they get older, and different mental health diagnoses as well, bipolar, schizophrenia, the antisocial personality disorder, impulse control, and childhood conduct disorder, along with cross addiction with other substances. These all have a bearing on to risk of developing a stimulant use disorder. So we kind of know what it is, how it impacts us, and what has the world tried to do, at least here in the United States, to manage it. Well, thankfully, in 1963, the Community Mental Health Act provided for the first federal assistance for local treatment of addiction under mental illness. Then in 65, the Drug Abuse Control Amendments prohibited illicit manufacturing of central nervous system stimulants and depressants. And then in 1970, the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act combined all the previous drug legislation and created schedules to rate drugs and new penalty as well. So the DEA schedules, if you will. So just to kind of highlight it, most will be found in Schedule 1 or 2 of the DEA's department there and the Control Act. So really the only difference is if it's a Schedule 2 stimulant, they both have a high potential of abuse. The only difference is if they can be used medically or not. So the Schedule 2s would be all your psychotropic medications, if you will, the Adderalls, the Vyvanse, and stuff like that. Different concentrations of actually cocaine are still used. About a 4 to 10% solution will be used in some surgeries, particularly eye surgeries at times, which was something apparently I had edited out or missed when I was moving things around. But when they created, when cocaine was out there in its medical time, that was one of the big impacts into the medical world was eye surgery was able to be done because of keeping the patient awake, but also needing to constrict the blood flow and to kind of, if you will, numb the area. Also nasal surgeries, it was used in a lot too. Schedule 1s are more of the other substances you would imagine, like methamphetamine and some of the other actual diet aids as well. So here's a few trends. So crack cocaine, cocaine and crack, I put them both together, not that they're, trying to pull back my window. So main production zones still are South America, primarily Colombia. And here was a few bits of statistics that I found, which I kind of thought was interesting because it wasn't anything I thought of, but it is also kind of what I think we've noticed, which is that, you know, fentanyl is mixed into a lot of everything now. So a lot of people have been experiencing overdoses when they are expecting to use, you know, cocaine, but there's fentanyl in it, which causes an overdose. So, but it's actually been going up since 2013, not necessarily when the fentanyl crisis was at its, I guess, most emerging points. So in 2010, about 4,000 people a year. This is all according to the CDC here in the US. And then by 2018, it's 14,000. But one of the growing questions always was, well, what did the pandemic do to, at this point, stimulants? Really nothing. It really had no impact at all. It slowed things down, as we'll see, for some of the distribution points, but not enough to even really make a big change in any of the death rates, the smuggling rates, and stuff like that. So it really did not make a big difference. And as you can see, the production of cocaine tripled. So in 2010, you had 329 metric tons that they had estimated that were made, you know, in other countries. But by 2019, 936 metric tons. And they based this off of, the DEA was basing it off of seizures and things like that that they would find. And at this point, the main transportation distribution into the US is all criminal organization controlled, and it's all through the cartels from Mexico. Now, it doesn't take away from the other criminal organizations that are operating in the other countries, such as Colombia, but to get it from Colombia into the US, they have to go through the cartels. Methamphetamine has had quite an increase, which there's more of it around here than I actually thought there was. So that was kind of surprising. So the highest availability is the West and Midwest. And for myself, I'm like, okay, yes, I think of the Midwest, I think of like, I'm going to go a little bit more rural. I'm going to go a little bit more west. I'm going to go a little bit more like Iowa, if you will, something really more rural. And myself, I had lived in the Southwest for a while, and it was very prevalent there because of its relatively closeness right to the border and its major flow in through Arizona. But here in the West and the Midwest regions, drug poisoning deaths skyrocketed. So this is just poisoning from the methamphetamine. So 2007, about 1,378 people, but 2018, you had 12,676 people. And, you know, even as we know, cocaine comes in from Mexico, so does a lot of methamphetamine. And perhaps we had heard of things such as like the super labs, where, you know, there used to be small labs that were in maybe someone's backyard or a house, as we had more domestic production of it. But because of the efforts of the DEA, really a lot of those small labs stopped, and now they just moved into super labs out of country. So down at the borders, the U.S. Border and Customs Department had a 74% increase at the southwest border from 2018 to 2019. And nationwide, all methamphetamine seizures went up 77% just in that 1 year. From 2013 to 2019, you can see the significant number of kilograms seized through the government agencies there. But when it comes to the super labs here in the US, it's significantly decreased, as I had mentioned. So 2000, we had about 9,000 of them. By 2019, only 890. But they all just moved out of country, as I mentioned. And what the DEA believes is the best reason for that was just the restriction of the ingredients, the things that we, you know, like if you're trying to go and buy your Sudafed at the store now, you have to, you know, produce an ID. You can only have some boxes of decongestants, those kind of efforts. Even to some of the other toxic chemicals used in manufacturing. A couple more things, as you'll notice here. I'll try and I'm almost done. But the top states that have found labs, dump sites for the substances and the waste, as well as any seizures from DA. 2019, New York did come in at the largest. So they had anywhere on the scale of 93 to 237 reports. But here we are, right there in the tie among Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Pretty much a good straight across tie in the color pattern that they were doing on the graphics. But comparing that to the rest of the nation, that was interesting to me, because I would have thought it would be seen more in, you know, as I just mentioned, the Southwest. It comes in there, but it doesn't necessarily stay there, because the Sinaloa cartel is the most dominant one in our area and in those other states, as you see listed above. So they are really moving the methamphetamine through. And a couple of quick points here. So from January to September of 2002, methamphetamine is actually used more than opiates for people from 20 to 49. And they had more emergency calls for fatal or non-fatal overdoses than opiate users of the same age range. This did not remove the fact that their methamphetamines could also have the mixture of fentanyl in it. But these are people, I would say, you know, a methamphetamine user would not be expecting to have a fentanyl overdose when they're not using an opioid. And then in 2019, of June to 2020, 39% increase of methamphetamine overdose fatalities. And of course, if they had an active opioid addiction, they're more likely to experience this as well. And then this, I do believe, will be our last slide here. There are a few other quick trends I wanted to mention, which is bath salts have gone down over the years, so people are not using them as much. Many of the stimulant pills that are out there that one would go out to purchase if illicitly, they're counterfeit. The pill presses that we know people can use to make the fentanyl tablets, they use them to make every other kind of tablet you can think of, and market it to their consumers just as that. But it's not Adderall, it's meth. And many of the supplements, diet aids, pre-workouts, and other items containing large amounts of caffeine are also still on the market. There's actually this website, this Operational Supplement Safety, has a checklist and things you can look at if these are items that you would be taking or using. But what I did not expect to read was that there's certain items that are banned by the Department of Defense. Soldiers can no longer use stimulants while being part of the active military versus what it was decades back when we gave them ones that were extremely powerful. So there has been a shift in recognizing it, trying to treat it, help those who are afflicted. And a few of these trends that are still in process that they're working on is trying to find ways to create a stimulant overdose reversal medication. They didn't really specify too much of what that was because it's all still in trials and lab testing and things like that, but a way to reverse those central nervous system spikes, particularly with the cardiovascular, but in a safer way than perhaps how they try now. And then lastly, there's also different medications they're looking into, a lot of it looking to address that acetylcholine, that very primary first transmitter that is impacted. And they believe that as they look to do that, to block it, it should help with the intensity of cravings that the person would have in their recovery. And that is it. So,
John, thank you so much for presenting for us, man. That was phenomenal. I know we're a couple of minutes over, and I've got to dump out relatively soon because I got to jump into another meeting. But I do want to open it up for a minute. If anybody has any questions or comments about the presentation.
you're welcome to email me too if you like.
Yeah. And
That was
as
really
always,
great, John. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I especially liked the reference to World War II. That was really interesting.
yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you everybody for coming. This will be put up on the YouTube if you want to share it with anybody. And make sure you're here for next one. I saw in our chat, Bruce Seawick is in here. He'll be presenting in April about psychedelics and their use in treating trauma. So really looking forward to that one. So thank you as always to everybody who attended, and thank you again to John, and everyone have a wonderful afternoon.
You all as well. Thanks for having me, and thanks for coming.